نودع العالم ونحن نعرف أنه باق من دوننا. لا شيء سيتوقف من أجلنا ولا شيء سيتأثر بغيابنا. لقد بذلنا قصارى جهدنا لكن أفعالنا لم يكتب لها الاكتمال، وها هو اليوم ينقضي سريعا. نودع العالم ونضع رؤوسنا على الوسائد، لكننا لا نودعه ونحن حزانا، وإنما ونحن مفعمون بالأمل. فهناك في قلب الظلام سرعان ما سنلتقي أملا ينمو بهدوء، أملا يقوى عوده كلما أوغلنا في الليل، أملا في الاستيقاظ، أملا في أن ينجلي الظلام، أملا في الغد، أملا في بداية جديدة، في أننا عندما سنفتح أعيننا غدا سيكون كل شيء على ما يرام. هذا الأمل يونع في جوف الليل كثمرة تنمو في الظلام، وتزداد حلاوتها كلما ازدادت حلكة الليل. الوصول إلى تلك الثمرة هو هدية النوم، فكل نوم هو ممارسة حقيقية للأمل، تدريب طويل على الانعطاف والتحرر. لكن إلى ماذا يستند هذا الأمل؟ الأرجح أنه يستند إلى ثقة لا نهائية في المجهول بعد تجاوز الخوف منه، ثقة في الغياب بعد أن أسلمنا أنفسنا إليه. هي ثقة لا نهائية في العالم الذي نودعه كل ليلة ونحن مطمئنون إلى أننا في أيدي أمينة. هذه الثقة تنشأ بعد أن نفقد موقعنا المسيطر على العالم ونستودعه أنفسنا ليفعل بها ما يشاء. لذلك فالأمل الكامل في النوم ليس كأي أمل، بل هو مبدأ الأمل، فهو لا ينبع من رغبة مرتبطة بموضوعها، وإنما ينبع من الرغبة الكبرى التي تتجاوز أي موضوع، الرغبة في العبور إلى الضفة الأخرى والانتماء إلى المجهول. سحر البروليتاريا الخفي. فوق سطح الكثير من اللوحات والصور يغفو عمال وفلاحات، فوعلية وأبناء شوارع، يهدهم التعب فيتسطحون في أماكن عملهم، أو ينامون متكئين بعضهم على بعض فوق أرصفة الشوارع. يراهم المشاهد وقد أخذت بعضهم خطوف النوم العميق، أو أزدل بعضهم الآخر جفونه فقط. نوم البروليتاريا كما يظهر في الكثير من اللوحات والصور يحدث دائما في مكان العمل أو في كنفه، إذ لا يحق للبروليتاريا أن تمتلك مكانا خاصا بها، فهي تعيش فقط في الحيز الذي اكتسبت منه اسمها، أي مكان العمل. كما لا يحق لها أن تمتلك زمانا خاصا بها، فليس لديها ليلا ولا نهار، وإنما هناك فقط ساعات لا تنتهي من العمل يتخللها سقوط خاطف في النوم بسبب التعب. ما الذي يجتذب ابن الطبقة الوسطى هكذا إلى نوم الطبقة العاملة؟ ما الذي يثيره في رؤية أجسادها المنهكة حد النوم؟ هل هو التلصص أم التعاطف الرخيص، أم لعله ممارسة حق الملكية الذي منحه لنفسه؟ فنوم ابن الطبقة الوسطى محمي دائما بالحوائط والأبواب، أما نوم ابن الطبقة العاملة فهو منتهك الحرمة، مسفوح على الطرقات لمن يرغب في امتلاكه. نوم الطبقة العاملة الذي يسجله أبناء الطبقة الوسطى في لوحاتهم وصورهم لا يخاطب سوى أبناء طبقتهم، فهو قد يثير مشاعرهم، أو في أحسن الأحوال يدعوهم لكي يمنحوا الكادحين بعض العطف وأحيانا بعض الحقوق، لكنه في أغلب الأحوال لا يخاطب النائمين. فابن الطبقة العاملة ليس من حقه أن ينام امتناعا عن العمل أو كسلا أو ضجرا، أو حتى أن ينام لأنه يرغب في النوم. من حقه فقط أن ينام مهدودا من التعب والكدح، أن يبقى عضوا في طبقة أسطورية لا يخرج منها. الطبقة العاملة تعمل حتى وهي نائمة، تعمل في صور الطبقة الوسطى لكي تختزل نفسها وكفاحها إلى مواضيع مثيرة للتعاطف، فتجيش المشاعر ويثبت الوضع. معلش أنا عندي صوت المرة الجاية.
There's also some antique seats here, maybe before we go. If anybody wants a seat, there's a few empty seats over here.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Rochelle, and thank you, Wendy Subway, and for you coming here on Sunday afternoon. Haytham, I'm so happy to read with you. I read a poem entitled احتفال or celebration. It should be in the handout you have in English. احتفال. وقع خيط القصة في الأرض فنزلت على ركبتي أبحث عنه. كان هناك ذلك الاحتفال الوطني ولم أرى إلا الأحذية المستوردة والبيادات. على مقعد قطار قالت لي أفغانية لم ترى أفغانستان: الانتصار ممكن. تمنيت يومها لو سألتها: هل هذه نبوءة؟ بدت تهتهتي بالفارسية كأنها خارجة من كتاب المبتدئين، وهي كأنها تلتقطها من خزانة ملابس قتل صاحبها في حريق. لنفرض أن الشعب وصل عن بكرة أبيه إلى الميدان، أن الشعب ليس كلمة قبيحة، كما أن لا أحد يعرف ما معنى بكرة أبيه. إذن كيف حضرت كل هذه الكلاب البوليسية إلى هنا، ومن غطى وجوهها بأقنعة ملونة؟ الأهم من ذلك، أين سقط الخيط الذي يفصل بين الأعلام والملابس الداخلية، بين الأناشيد والنشيد، بين الله وكائناته التي تمشي على الأرض لتدفع الضرائب؟ الاحتفال. كأنني لم أنطق هذه الكلمة من قبل، كأنها خرجت لتوها من قاموس إغريقي، حيث رجع أهالي سبارتا منتصرين إلى سبارتا، ولم يجف دم الفرس على التروس والرماح. ربما لم يكن هناك قطار ولا نبوءة ولا أفغانية جلست أمامي لساعتين. أن الله يضلل ذاكرة مخلوقاته من وقت لآخر ليتسلى، ولكن المؤكد أنني من موقعي هنا بين الأحذية والبيادات لن أعرف من بالضبط انتصر على من.
Thank you, Haytham. Thank you, Iman. So maybe we can start by talking a little bit about why each of you chose these excerpts to begin with, and maybe you can situate them for us within sort of the broader trajectory of your writings. So, Iman, this poem is a 2008 poem, I think, that appears in your new volume, The Threshold. And Haytham, the Book of Sleep came out in 2017. So maybe you can talk a little bit about where you think of these pieces within sort of a broader trajectory of writing and why you chose them to start us off.
Yeah, I actually choose this particular poem because I'm reading with Haytham. And I was rereading the Book of Sleep when I came across a passage. I think it was entitled the Ghaybuba or Coma. And in this passage, Haytham is asking the question: if revolution is awakening, then isn't sleep a return to disposition? And after some meditation, he reached the idea that in the instant that we enter sleep, we actually we don't mark the one set of failure. It simply concedes it. And this reminded me right away of this poem, not because of any similarity, but because the poem was written 2008, the Book of Sleep was published 2017. revolution, celebration, failure, sleep, are just a few notions that are out there in the two texts. And this made me think, do we really write before revolution and after revolution, but we don't write about revolution itself? We don't write during the moment of revolution, as if the moment of revolution, either it's a moment of hope or a moment also of sleep in some way, and it's postponed until the complete disaster take place, as Haytham would say. Or for me, I feel the poems and the texts that are used during the revolution are required by readership, required by it being easy to share and distribute and memorize, while these kind of writings are non-required really writing for revolution at all. And since I have already a conversation with Haytham for I think a long time about that, I would like to ask you, Haytham, actually, after you tell us why did you choose this passages from the Book of Sleep, I want to ask you, what is the position of the writer in revolution? I mean, is there a yeah?
You did not ask me this.
Yeah, I would ask you this, but I meant something else by it. I didn't ask you to hear what I knew. I want to take this actually to ask you about what sorts of writing is required about revolution after its failure. What did the revolution did to you in terms of writing, in terms of your project? Did it confuse you? Did it make you think about different tone of voice, different genre as well, and so on and so forth? No, I'm not interested to hear what I know that you will say if I ask you just a question about the position of a writer in revolution.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it's really a great and complicated set of questions. Yeah, let's see how we can tackle them. Why I choose these two passages? Like one reason was really very simple, that I thought like to take parts from short stories, it will not be really very significant or telling anything, and so I thought maybe passages from Book of Sleep would like make sense, or and the second reason is close to what you were saying, which is yes, there was a sense of interruption or disruption, which my writing kind of, or my engagement with writing went through with the experience of the last decade, let's say, like all what happened, like working on this book was what kind of my way maybe like to go through this very harsh experience, and I was trying like now thinking about it, I was trying maybe like to do two things. One thing is really to capture the sense of interruption or disturbance, which actually sleep is introducing almost like every day, and the second thing was really like looking for the healing powers of sleep, right? Like it was also like a journey or an attempt to to activate or to mobilize or some healing powers. What kind of, it's really complicated question. Maybe, like one thing which comes to my mind, immediately after 2011, there was a question in the air, which is, like how the events of 2011 would change literature, or would change the way, like the kind of writings or the way of writings, and I mean, there are good reasons to pose this question, and I remember, like many conversation around this, and I think, the relationship between literature and reality is very complex, and I don't belong to writers who, who think that writing is really making a kind of an image or a copy or something from reality. Rather, writing maybe is a way to engage with reality by introducing literary forms which could rob our assurance that, like that assurance that we know how to say things, assurance that we understand reality, assurance that we, and I think the kind of writing which interests me is really what shakes this a little bit, and what tries to give form for the cracks which are happening actually in the reality itself. So yeah, and that's why I think, like, because the relationship is very complex, then that's why, yeah, so I'm happy that Ali is here, because Ali is thinking a lot about the autonomy, like the autonomy of art, autonomy of literature, etc. And autonomy is a very problematic notion, right? Like, so what could be, like the autonomy of art. But I think, like, there is writing has its history, and it's kind of revolutions and it's kind of, like, but this does not make it outside of history, right? Like, but it all the changes and the different movements in writing itself are all the time in contact with the historical unfolding of events. So yeah, I don't know if this answers your question.
Maybe you can use this as a sort of segue to talk a little bit about form and genre.
Yeah.
And you both sort of work between different forms, and actually even within those forms kind of challenge. And I think this idea that you're talking about, Haytham, about sort of the disruption of what we think we know, or what we think we know writing can do. I think you both take up in your work in the way that you sort of move between different genres. So I wanted to sort of ask you to talk a little bit more about that, both of you, but particularly in our conversations preceding today, we talked, Haytham, about sort of a 90s generation of writers in Egypt that is really sort of formed and informed by poetry as a kind of central movement, right, in a revolution of sorts within poetry in Egypt at that time. So even as someone who's not a poet, who's not writing in sort of a poetic form per se, that you sort of were stressing the importance of that on your generation of writers. So I wanted to sort of hear you both kind of reflect on the way that you see the relationships between the different genres that you work in, and particularly kind of a relationship between poetry and what we would sort of call nonfiction.
I mean, I'm a poet who used to write in the 90s, so it's much better if Haytham talks about this. But I just wanna maybe say two things. It's like for me, actually, the moment of revolution in writing is different than the actual revolution. This is a comment about what Haytham said. So this moment was in the 90s, and I let you talk about it in terms of poetry, not me. But I just want to say that even revolution in writing takes sometimes particular form and debate that is not really the most important thing about it. So if we talk about the 90s, we talk usually about political context, the Gulf War, the collapse of Soviet Union, and of course the poverty and the hypocrisy that paints usually societies torn between modernity and patriarchy and so on. And the second thing usually comes to mind is the prose poem as a form. And did you choose the form because it's revolutionary in itself or not? And I just want to say that I don't think writers choose forms at all, whatever form it is. It's like, according to your questions, like attempt to find your tone of voice, to say what you want to say, to ask the questions you have. The style comes along, and actually you might find you after this in a corner asked, why do you write non-fiction in particular, not novel or prose poem, not free verse, and so on and so forth. But I really want Haytham to talk about the 90s because he is not a poet, he thinks. I think he is a fantastic poet in his prose writing. But he actually, I heard some of his ideas about the 90s as, centered around poetry. And it would be nice if you...
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, so maybe, like one way to put it is that, poetry was my literary education. Back in the 90s, most of my friends were interested in prose poem, and many interesting things were happening there. And actually for me, that was the most exciting thing which happened back at that time, basically, what was happening in poetry and all, it wasn't only aesthetical conflict with previous generations, but it was, the manifestation of social and political conflict, right? Which the playground of this was poetry. And this is something is not is not new, actually. If you think about the conflict around romantic poetry, for instance,
or free verse.
Exactly, yeah. or free verse, etc. And all these conflicts are not just literary or aesthetical conflicts, but as well they are social conflicts, in the sense that they manifest a social antagonism, which is taking place, a specific antagonism which is taking place at this moment, right? Which is a moment, as you were saying, the collapse of the old left project and kind of the rise of right Islamic project, and the frustration of the two projects, and the search and the need, to find new language for what's happening, etc. So exactly. So I was surrounded by a group of friends and people, who were mostly writing poems as a form, and I wasn't writing poems. I mean, I was not the only one also who was not writing poems, right? So there were a couple of us who were not writing poems. but somehow, yeah, like it was, as I said, it was really my like my literary education happened by my friends, right? Like and like the different groups and circles which we were part of, and this really the effect of this is is still unfolding on me. I feel like there is something really big happened there, and it's still unfolding. And yeah, maybe that's why like when we were talking about the genre question, I see like the necessity to rethink what we call nonfiction, right? Because I feel that this term does not really capture the potentiality of what is happening in books like, for instance, Iman Mersal, Traces of Aniyat al-Zayyat, or her book about motherhood, or like some books by Ala Khalid, for instance, or also what I was trying in Kitab al-Noom, for instance, and for me, like this kind of book, they are not non-fiction. They belong to the project of poetry. Although like they don't have poems in them. And why do I think that? What is the project of poetry? Hard to say, but like for me, what I would suggest like is that one sense of poetry like is the refusal of stable genre, for instance, is the power not to accept what we have been given, right? Like poetry just keeps like being unsatisfied with like ways of writing, or with like ways of saying things, and ways of and I feel like these books, they kind of practice or they are touched by this force, and I think non-fiction just does not capture what's happening there. Rather, it is a very bureaucratic classification. Like you have fiction on one hand, and you have like where there are imagination, etc., and then non-fiction where yeah. So yeah, yani, the way I'm trying to think about genre is also very much influenced by this question of poetry, or the poetical question, let's say.
No, if you had. I really thank you. I agree with you, of course. I just want to add something about the necessity of leaving the form of a poem aside a little bit. But at least for me, since I was writing poetry up to 2011, and actually this poem I just read, Ihtifal, as I said, was written 2008, after 2 years without writing any poems, and a series of poems were written after, which was published 2013, and I didn't publish a poetry book since. There was a moment, I think, that let's say the revolution impact on us, this disruption that we went through, when you feel actually the necessity to search for your voice in another land. Yes, it's informed by poetry. It's a poetry project, but still it's not poems. It's not a straightforward poems. And I remember very well this kind of an anxiety. It's like you are dealing with a blank page, and you want this blank page, you want to move on to writing after long time with this blank page, until you feel that you have something that you want to say, but you don't know how to say it. So for me, I don't know how to say it is actually what brought me to what's called non-fiction, which I agree with you, it shouldn't be called non-fiction, but just for the sake of communication. And then you find yourself involved in a project like Motherhood or Traces or a book I'm working on now, which doesn't mean that poetry is far away, but it means actually that poetry can live in this land as well.
I just want to, just to follow up on this, and I think this might maybe takes us back to this question of what writing, the relationship between writing and revolution, or like what we can sort of think about the role that writing would do, or how do we change thinking about writing. And one of the things that I was thinking about when I was listening to you both read both of these extracts is the way that both of the projects are kind of informed by rethinking or sort of reimagining, from, especially sort of from perspective. So in your poem, Man, the fact that it begins with someone kind of looking for the thread of the story, right, on their hands and knees, right, and it's from that perspective of being on the ground that one can, that you sort of try and look up and think about what is happening, and is this actually like a possibility of change. And then in the Book of Sleep, I think the way that in each of the sections you are taking on, and I think this is also true of How to Disappear, is a sort of rethinking terminology and rethinking the meaning of words, right, and rethinking the way we actually think of something like sleep, but also the way we think about something like hope. And so I wanted you both maybe to talk a little bit about this different perspective, or the way that you play with perspective in these two sections, and how that is maybe the project of rethinking writing, or approaching writing with a different set of questions. And I know that the poem is a sort of pre-revolution poem, right? But I think
it's read usually as a revolution.
Exactly, but I think it's asking some of the same questions, yeah. Right? It's asking like what happens when we look from somewhere different, or what happens when we think about the vocabulary to have a different kind of set of meanings from our assumed meanings, which I think is also what you were talking about when you were talking about this idea of disruption, right? This idea of kind of rethinking what we think we already know, or what we understand literature to be doing, or what we understand writing to be doing.
Yeah. طيب يعني So there is a very nice article by Walid Sadiq, a Lebanese artist and educator, a text called The Impregnated Witness. And in this text he was thinking about, like art during the Civil War and art after the Civil War. And he was interested in a specific notion of witnessing. What does it mean to witness? And he was criticizing a sense of witnessing which, the survival witness, the witness which, survived and write their accounts on what happened. And he was more interested in another kind of witnessing, which he called impregnated witness. And this impregnated witness, did not survive. This impregnated witness is all their senses is dearranged, and that's exactly how something big can find a form, or that's exactly how maybe we can speak about something like civil war, or social protests and etc. And I found there is really something very interesting in that, and which is basically it's not writing about something which has finished, rather it is the afterlife of the cracks and the wounds which actually form us, right? And the question is, how to work through these wounds and cracks, how to work through this dearrangement which happened because of what had happened, right? And so I think and this is maybe back to your question, Iman, about what would be an interesting sort of text, at a certain moment, a moment of for instance 2011 to 2013, etc., and what had happened after. And so while I was working on this book, I was really attracted to the tendency to have a clear cut between passivity and activity, right? It was the time of activity, it was the time of action, and of course it was important to act and react, etc. But then at a certain moment and point, at a certain moment of of breaking up, of then you start thinking about what would be the point of continuing the struggle only through activity, when activity is really reached a dead end, so what's the point, rather maybe it's time to think about what does actually passivity mean, right? And what kind of political potentiality are in in things like listening, or being tired or bored or sleeping, etc. All these sort of kind of unrevolutionary activity, right? And I was kind of interested in thinking about these things, and how to mobilize the forces and the healing forces there politically. It's, I mean, it doesn't make sense, but for me, it was and this is back to your question, Dina, that's what kind of helped me to try to speak about this time, let's say, so it's really a big detour, right? It's and I think such detours are necessary. They don't distract us. I mean, of course, sometimes there can be also distraction, but I think in front of a dead end, a detour is very necessary. And detour, you never know where the detour will take you, and but it's necessary to come back, so to speak. I don't know if this answers the question.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this thinking about activity or passivity as a form of activity, right, or a reimagining of passivity as a form of activity, also just opens up possibilities for which we can act in moments where it seems like the ways in which we've been acting are no longer afforded to us anymore, or actually, like you said, we've hit a dead end, which I think really, a moment in 2013 in Egypt really was one of those moments, right, where the ways in which we had acted had really, we really hit an impasse. And so I think this idea of rethinking the spaces that we might have neglected as potential spaces to be activated is kind of the only way out of this moment.
One possible way.
Yeah.
Well, I'll actually go back to the first sentence, Haytham, in your answer of the question, how to understand the wounds that shaped us. And I mean, at least for the last decade, I felt like drifting and wasting time in the archive is my way of dealing with so many things. But also like visiting the past in general, or searching the archive with a question that doesn't stay as it is. It actually changes with when you search it. I'm talking about the archive, not the physical archive only, which we usually don't have access to. But the archive may be as described as a kind of reading the past in so many ways. So I think I'm not sure if this is laziness or activity or passivity. It could be actually all of these, because sometimes you go for drifting in the archives without doing any particular thing. But let's say reading the past became a way to survive in this last decade, and the archive here is not just the documents we go to read, but also the oral stories, whatever is excluded from the archive itself, and also whatever is there but is forgotten. And I think I experienced this during writing my book of Hanayat Zayat, which actually I didn't understand what I was doing until Haytham wrote an article about this book, seriously, because I thought I'm ruining my career as a writer by doing something that doesn't make any sense. But as soon as I read the sentence of the first sentence actually was how to understand or live with the wound that shaped us, and I think archive here can be a key to both projects. They are different than each other, absolutely, but I think archive can be something that we can discuss, that can, especially with the second round of readings, that can bring this.
I just want to say that we thought the first round of readings were going to be the light readings. And now we're getting to the heavy stuff. That's how we were framing it. But yeah, so maybe we can go on to the second set of readings. And so Haytham, you're going to read to us from your latest collection, Bennett Owen Missing Letters, in which you revisit Arabic fables, listening to the speech of animals rather than humans, in search of much needed hope in our state of post-Arab Spring speechlessness. And then Iman, you want to read a section from Hanayat Zayat, which will appear in English this August under Traces of Hanayat, in which you return to a little-known novel, Love and Silence, that made a great impression on you when you first read it, and you go about trying to piece together a picture of its author who committed suicide before the publication of the novel, and then sort of this kind of unravels actually, and becomes a much broader history of a particular moment in literary history in Egypt actually. So maybe we can have both of those readings and then...
Do you want to... I mean, the order of the reading. Okay. Those who have handouts, it's the second reading by خدمتكم إيمان. Okay. I read part of the first chapter in Hanayat Zayat book because it was so difficult to choose really anything. It would be overwhelming with names and events. So I'm reading actually the blank page in this book, as to say. أخذ السائق طريق صلاح سالم حتى ميدان السيدة عائشة. اتجه يمينا لعدة دقائق وأنزلني عند مدخل في سور وقال لي اسألي وستجدين ألف من يدلك. مشيت في شارع مستقيم، عن يميني سور عالي بعض أجزائه من الحديد ولونه أسود، وعن شمالي أبواب المدافن وجدرانها المطلية حديثا بالأصفر. لمحت طفلة قادمة في اتجاهي تلبس ثوبا بنفسجيا له طبقات من القرانيش، وعلى رأسها أرجفة خبز فوق شبكة من جريد النخل. كان مشهدها عن بعد خلابا، حتى إنني تمنيت لو كانت لدي شجاعة سائحة فألتقط لها صورة. توقف صوت شبشبها بعد أن عبرتني، فالتفت وجدتها واقفة تنظر إلي والتقت عينانا. سألتها إن كانت تعرف العفيفي. قالت: ده راجل ولا شارع؟ خمنت أنها أكبر قليلا مما ظننت. مشيت خطوتين نحوها وسألتها عن الطريق للفرن، فوصفته بدقة. لم يكن هناك الازدحام الذي توقعته، وشعرت أن العيون تحدق بي. سألتني امرأة عما أريد، وبينما أحاول أن أحدد هل العفيفي شارع أم حارة، قال رجل جالس على الأرض يتشمس ويدخن: تلاقيها من بتوع الجرانين اللي بيجوا يصوروا ويمشوا. سألته بأدب وكأني لم أسمعه إن كان يعرف مدفن رشيد باشا في العفيفي. قال بثقة: مفيش عفيفي هنا خالص، بس فيه عوش أبو عوف، لو عايزاه أوديكي. قلت لنفسي فلأتجول بحرية إذن، وعندما أسأل في المرة القادمة سأستخدم كلمة حوش وليس مدفن. لو لم أصل إلى عنايات اليوم فسترسل لي إشارة عندما تريد. مشيت بلا هدف، أتفرج على بوابات أحواش وأقرأ أسماء عائلات، أشاهد الكثير في كل خطوة دون أن أقصد التلصص. مزاجي غامض، لست محبطة، فقد علمتني عنايات منذ سنين أن لا شيء عنها يأتي بسهولة. ليس عندي حسرة واضحة على جمال المقابر القديمة، ولا إدانة أخلاقية لإهانة رفات الموتى. لا أذكر من أصدقائي وصف مزاجه مرة بحالة تنميل. عجبني التشبيه. حولي أحياء ينامون ويستيقظون ويأكلون ويتعاركون ويتكاثرون. مشهد قبيح ومؤذن، ومن الأفضل ألا يرى، ولكنه برهان على إرادة الحياة في نفس الوقت. تتحول الدهشة تدريجيا إلى ألفة في المرور على أسماء وغرف نوم ومطابخ وتشوت غسيل مفتوحة على الشارع، في أسلاك الكهرباء المشدودة فوق الخط الكوفي، وكل نفس ذائقة الموت. يتجاور الصبار والورد الجاف وأكوام القمامة ورائحة البول والثوم الذي يقلى في زيت. يجري أطفال حفاة يرتدي أحدهم تيشيرت أديداس. بوتاجاز مسطح فوق مقبرة. منشر غسيل ممدود بين شجرة وشاهد من الرخام. ميادة الحناوي تغني أنا بعشقك. وراء مبرورة الجو عدة رجال يدخنون تحت شجرة خلفها بوابة خضراء بديعة في زخرفتها، جميعهم بكلوتات بيضاء ولا ملابس أخرى، كأنهم مصطفون على شاطئ خيالي. بدأ عقلي يتجول هو الآخر بغير هدى. تذكرت أنني أتيت إلى مقابر البساتين في 1995. لم تكن جنازة، بل حفل زفاف لا أعرف أصحابه، وينشد فيه الشيخ ياسين التهامي. بدت هذه المقابر ليلتها أجمل مكان في العالم. نسيم الصيف وأضواء هضبة الهرم وغرباء يمدون أيديهم بسجائرهم المحشوة لك. وبحت صوت التهامي وهو يقول: لا خير في الحب إن أبقى على المهجي. ليلتها تفوت في مكاني لساعات بذلك الشعور العجيب بأنك مقطوع من الماضي ومن واقعك الشخصي. لست في نزهة ولا سفر، بل رحلة إسراء ستنتهي بانتهاء الليل.
Yeah, thank you, Iman. I will read you a part from the new book, بنات أوى والحروف المفقودة. And yes, so it as you were saying, Dina, it started with a heavy feeling of speechlessness, a current speechlessness, and combined with an interest in fables where there is an act of speech but comes from from animals or non-humans, and whereas the humans, they are the one who are listening, and this kind of it was like a journey which where the question of inheriting the past became very central, and that's one of the reasons actually we thought maybe it's nice to read from these two projects, because anyways, okay. يحكى أن ولاعة سجائر تكلمت ذات يوم، قالت: أنا النار وأنتم القتلة، ولم يصدقها أحد. أول مرة نطقت فيها كانت عندما أمسك بها رجل الشرطة وأخذ يتفحصها. ولاعة حمراء عادية يملأها الغاز إلى نحو منتصفها، وقبل أن يلقي بها في كيس الأحراز البلاستيكي قالت جملتها تلك، فانتظر أن تكرر ما قالته لكنها لم تفعل، فوضعها في الكيس وأغلقه على الفور. ظل الكيس قابعا في دولاب قسم الشرطة ولا يخرجه الشرطي إلا أيام جلسات المحاكمة التي امتدت لسنوات عديدة. في كل جلسة كانت القاضية تطلب معاينة الأحراز، فيتقدم الشرطي بالكيس البلاستيكي ويفتحه ويخرج الولاعة واضعا إياها على طاولة القاضية. تسأل القاضية السؤال التقليدي عن ملابسات العثور عليها، فيكرر الشرطي الإجابة التقليدية أنه عندما فتح الزنزانة لم يعثر على المحتجز، كل ما عثر عليه كان ولاعته. تسأله القاضية عن تفسير دخول الولاعة بعد تجريده منها الليلة السابقة، فيقول لها الشرطي إنه لا يعرف. تقلب في الأوراق التي أمامها قليلا ثم تقول: هل تعتقد أن السيد أوري جالو الذي قبضت عليه في ليلة 7 يناير وأودعته الزنزانة قد تحول إلى ولاعة؟ فيبتسم الشرطي ويقول: لا يوجد بشر يتحولون إلى ولاعات يا سيدتي القاضية. فتسأله: أين ذهب إذن؟ فيهز كتفيه بلا مبالاة ويقول: لا أعرف. ثم تتطلع القاضية إلى الولاعة الحمراء الملقاة على طاولتها، فتقول الولاعة: أنا النار وأنتم القتلة. تنظر إلى الشرطي مستغربة وتسأله: هل قالت الولاعة شيئا للتو؟ فيرد الشرطي: ولاعات السجائر لا تتحدث يا سيدتي. فتهز القاضية رأسها ثم تطلب من الشرطي أن يحمل أحرازه ويذهب. في كل جلسة يحدث المشهد نفسه. في جلسة المحاكمة الأخيرة سألت القاضية رئيس الشرطة عن تفسير لتبخر السيد أوري جالو في الهواء، فقال إنه لا يمتلك تفسيرا ولكنه يصدق رجاله. سألته القاضية عن سبب اندلاع جرس الحريق في ليلة القبض على السيد جالو وعن سبب حذف الواقعة من محضر القضية فيما بعد، فأجاب رئيس الشرطة أنه في الليلة نفسها التي احتجز فيها السيد جالو بسبب الشك في صحة أوراق لجوئه شب حريق في الشجرة القائمة في فناء قسم الشرطة، مما أدى إلى اندلاع جرس الحريق، وأشار بيده إلى النافذة. فنظرت القاضية نحو ساق الشجرة المتقدة التي كانت تستطيع رؤيتها من مكانها، وتابع قائلا: تعرفين سيادتك قصة الشجرة بلا شك، لابد أن مستشعرات الجرس التقطت دخان احتراقها بسبب قربها من المكان، وعندما عرفنا أن سبب الحريق لا يمت بصلة للقضية حذفناه من محضرها. ثم طلبت القاضية رؤية الأحراز للمرة الألف، فتقدم الشرطي وفتح الكيس البلاستيكي وأخرج الولاعة. في هذه المرة ارتدت القاضية قفازا بلاستيكيا ووضعت الولاعة في راحتها وأخذت تتطلع إليها بتمعن، فخرج صوت الولاعة واهنا للغاية: أنا النار وأنتم القتلة. نظرت القاضية كالعادة إلى الشرطي فنظر إليها مطمئنا. سألته للمرة الألف: كيف دخلت الولاعة إلى الزنزانة بعد أن جردت السيد جالو منها الليلة السابقة؟ فأجاب الشرطي للمرة الألف: لا أعرف. أطالت القاضية النظر إلى الولاعة منتظرة أن يصدر عنها صوت آخر، لكن وجهها المعدني بقي مائلا وجسمها الأحمر منحنيا على نفسه، وظلت صامتة في راحة يدها. تطلعت القاضية إلى رئيس الشرطة وتطلعت من النافذة إلى الشجرة المتقدة وأعادت النظر إلى الولاعة ثم أصدرت حكمها. قضت محكمة مدينة ديساو بأنه لا شبهة جنائية في اختفاء السيد أوري جالو، وبالتالي إغلاق ملف القضية نهائيا. في اليوم نفسه الذي أصدرت فيه القاضية حكمها النهائي، أتى العمال إلى فناء قسم الشرطة القريب من مقر المحكمة لكي يجتثوا الشجرة. كان هذا هو الحل النهائي للمشكلة، فمنذ أن أمسكت النار بأغصانها قبل 14 عاما لم يستطع أحد إطفاءها، إذ كلما جاءت قوات الإطفاء وصوابوا نحوها خراطيمهم الضخمة لا يكاد ينطفئ لهب النار حتى يعود ليتجدد في اليوم التالي. ومثل إمساك النار بأقدم شجرة في المدينة لغزا كبيرا، فكلف فريق علمي بكشف سر هذه الظاهرة الغريبة، وخرج الفريق بفرضية أن تكون التربة الغنية بالكربون قد جعلت الشجرة قابلة للاشتعال، وعلى إثره غيروا تربة الشجرة، لكن اللهب ظل ممسكا بها. ثم اقترح الفريق نقل الشجرة إلى مكان آخر، لكن مجلس المدينة رفض لقيمتها التاريخية، إذ أن الشجرة زرعت بعد نهاية حرب 30 عاما. ومضت الشهور تلو الشهور، وخيط رفيع من الدخان يمتد كل ليلة من الشجرة المتقدة ويتمدد فوق أسطح بيوت المدينة. مرت السنوات ولم يعد هناك حل سوى اجتثاث الشجرة المشتعلة من الجذور. وفي يوم اجتثاث الشجرة وقف ولد وأمه يتفرجان على ما يجري في فناء قسم الشرطة. سأل الولد أمه عما يحدث، فقالت وعيناها جاحظتان: إنهم يجتثون الشجرة يا بني، هل تعلم ماذا يعني ذلك؟ لم ينطق الولد، فأردفت الأم: إنها الشجرة التي زرعها أجداد أجدادنا، وعمرها يقترب من 400 عام. وقف السكان واجمين وهم يشاهدون الجرافة الكبيرة التي جاءت بعد أن حسم مجلس المدينة رأيه، ويشاهدون العمال وهم يحفرون حول الشجرة. كان العمال يرتدون ملابس برتقالية، شعورهم سوداء وأعينهم سوداء. ثم اقتربت الجرافة البرتقالية اللون وأدخلت أسنانها المدببة في الحفر حول الشجرة، وأخذت تمزق الجذور واحدا وراء الآخر. وفاحت رائحة جوف الأرض في المكان. بعدها تقدمت الجرافة ونطحت الساق، فلم تهتز الشجرة. فعادت الجرافة إلى الخلف، ثم تقدمت بكل قوة ونطحت الساق فاهتزت قليلا. لم يحدث شيء لعدة لحظات، ثم هوت الشجرة محدثة جلبة عارمة وسط صراخ المتفرجين، وما أن انهارت حتى انكب عليها العمال وأعملوا مناشيرهم في خشب الساق بعد أن بردوه. ثم حملت الجرافة الشجرة المتفحمة وسارت بعيدا. وأخيرا أهال العمال التراب مرة أخرى في مكان الجذور، وفرشوا بكرة من الحشيش الجاهز فوقها. في تلك الليلة خيم على المدينة ظل ثقيل، ولم يحصل أحد على نوم هادئ. في الصباح استيقظ السكان على جلبة وهرج ومرج، كان بعضهم يصرخ وبعضهم يجري في الطرقات. صاروا مرعوبين حتى وصلوا إلى فناء مركز الشرطة وتسمروا أمامه. لقد شقت باطن الأرض صخرة صغيرة في مكان الشجرة المشتعلة نفسه. كان حجم الصخرة لا يتجاوز حجم يقطينة متوسطة، ومنها انبثقت جداول رفيعة من حمم اللافا. تدفقت بعض جداول اللافا إلى الشوارع المحيطة بمبنى الشرطة، وتجمع بعضها الآخر حول الصخرة مشكلا بحيرة صغيرة من اللافا السائلة المتوهجة. كان المفروض بس أقول إن Dessau is a city in Germany, in east of Germany, and yeah.
Thank you, Haytham. It was really great to hear that read in Arabic after hearing it in English more recently. Maybe both of these texts, I think, we selected from these two books because we wanted to have a conversation about relationships to sort of the past, relationships to the inherited past, to tradition, but also ways, as you hinted, Iman, of thinking about the archive in different ways and the sort of expansive understanding of the archive. And especially in your book, the way that you kind of move between sort of private and public archive, and then also showing the limitations of both, and the sort of history that then comes out of that, which is a sort of literary history that also shows the expectations and spaces that were given to women writers in the sort of post-1952 moment. And so maybe you want to sort of think together or say a little bit more about how you kind of see this connection also between these two projects, and this kind of returning to particular moments with an interest in sort of marginalized voices. And I think both of these books are sort of an exercise in listening to voices that have been previously ignored, right? Whether it's that voices that are hidden in places in the archive, or the voices of the lighter in this case, but animals in the collection more broadly.
Oh, he wants to relax a little bit. Yeah, actually, I can talk a little bit about Banat Awa, Haytham latest book. I mean, reading it really, I was taken by him rereading the birth of metaphor in Arabic culture, and going back to what we can call the golden age of Arab civilization. And this took my attention for so many reasons. Usually going back to the heritage in Arab culture, I mean, I can give you some ideas about big cycles or waves of revisiting the Arabic heritage. After 1967 war, there were big cultural projects to replace the failing political projects. Basically, after 67 was the failing of Abdel Nasser regime, and you know, the discourse of really Arab nationalism and all of the propaganda around that. So Arab culture witnessed so many projects such as Tayyip Tizini, from revolution to heritage, from heritage to revolution, makes sense more, where he is selecting, actually dividing the heritage into good and bad, and let's take the good based on a particular concept or ideology that is Marxist ideology, of course. At the same time, Adonis wrote Thabit wal Mutahawil, or fixed and dynamic, and he did the opposite. So he was choosing actually Sufism, because French Surrealism is similar to Arab Muslim Sufism, and in order to build our modernism in Arabic culture, we have to start from the Karmati, for example, which is a political movement that started or was established in 899 EC. And so it's going back to select and to evaluate, and then to select, and then to apply particular items. So this, if 1967 was a moment of disaster, I'm using Haytham lovely terminology, talking about disaster and what follows. We had big projects to read our heritage in this way, how to choose some of it to be modern, or to be more just, or blah blah blah. And in Haytham book, when you see this in Haytham book, it was for me very really not just a new way of reading the heritage or visiting it, but also a genuine way, because I think he went to this heritage without ideology, without agenda. Basically, I think it was a question that developed through the book, talking about the animal speaking and human listening, talking about the birth of metaphor, trying to contemplate our moment now and here by revisiting this moment in Arab culture. And of course the book is more than this, because it has also some what might be really independent short stories, but somehow they are linked to this big question. So the question was about archive. I'm so sorry. So I want to say very quickly. I really a friend of mine, his name was Wa'il Ashri, a very dear friend, suggested reading Saidiya Hartman a few years ago, and when I read here, I really started to think about archive in a completely different way. Saidiya Hartman says that to visit the archive is to visit a morgue. And this short sentence sent me places, thinking about why do we visit a morgue? I mean, we don't visit a morgue to take selfie with it, not to drift in it. It will not have, we will not have any respect for the corpse or the dead if we are going just to know. So I think visiting the archive is usually based on your question, because without question, visiting the archive is absurdity, and it doesn't mean that your question will remain with you while you are in the archive. And visiting the archive, either it's physical or oral, or even walking in a city and thinking about the traces of other things that disappeared and demolished and so on. Your question will change absolutely, and sometimes it's not consistent, the question about the archive, but it happens, it changes in relation with this process of reading the past. And sometimes I think about it as there is similarity between a detective who is trying to find the person who caused the murders or the murder of someone, and visiting the archive, but the detective is looking obviously for evidence, while when we go to the archive, we are searching really for understanding, for joy sometimes, and for interpretation to all of these dots that don't make sense. But visiting the archive all the time, as Haytham said, in different way, you have to go from your present here and now to visit it. You can't go from the future like Tayyip Tizini, the revolutionary, reading of the archive, or Adonis. It has to, and I'll use one of Haytham words, al-atab, to find to understand the reasons behind al-atab, which is, I don't know how to translate al-atab. It could be fault or flaw, but I like also when al-fakiha ta'tab, yani spoilage, yes. So this word, like to understand the reasons of the atab that we are living now and here. Sorry,
Nothing? That's all right.
Yeah. So there was this sentence which translates something, which is would be translated to something like, any real journey starts from the graveyard, which is a sentence was written by Anayat Zayed in her manuscript.
This is he's making an ad about the book, which will come in August. There it is in Arabic.
Yes.
Sorry.
And this sentence is from the manuscript of her second book, which is unfinished and not published. We just have one book from Anayat Zayed. And I think there are many things happening in this sentence, and maybe one of them, is really, to make this link between the present and the past, or the living and the dead. And I think it's necessary to emphasize that the dead is not an ontological category, but a political category. And those who are dead, they were engaged in activities to imagine another future, and they struggled for that, and this future did not arrive. And those who comes in the future of these people. Like, for instance, us in the future of Anayat Zayat, you know, we realize that, you know, we failed to make this future possible. And one thing to do is to look back to the past, not with nostalgia, but rather to try to learn something to help us in this, you know, even more mighty deadlock which is confronting us. You know, this journey, I think, is actually, you know, like, it's not, you know, it's not only, you know, like, both of us are interested in this journey, or let's say, you know, like, inheriting what has not been, you know, given or handed down to us, because it's not wealth, it's not fortune, right? Rather, it is something else, and this something else has to be, you know, like, has to be captured. We have to listen carefully to capture this thing which we should inherit. Inherit. Yeah. Yeah. So it's you know, like, I think. So, for instance, I was reading really a great book by Sarah Abu Ghazal, a Palestinian writer, and the book is called Hlami Sidi, and part of this book is really, you know, like, the relationship between the grandfather who in 1948 had to leave their village, and the relationship between the grandfather and the granddaughter. They almost did not see each other, but he was telling her about, you know, like, what kind of protest the dead are doing in, you know, like, in heaven. And they did fantastic, you know, like, forms of protest, because they refused to move from the first heaven farther, because they said, no, we will not leave. We have to wait and to see, you know, like, what our brothers and sisters have been gone through, and they were successful in this. So the struggle, you know, like, did not finish there. You know, like, the struggle is going on. And one interesting or one important thing to for any journey, you know, like, is to realize the different forms and ways the struggles are still on, so to speak, you know, like, all the afterlife of these struggles. And I don't think this is only in Anayat. I think, you know, like, in Iman's work, you know, like, you can see this in the book on the motherhood, how to mend, but also, you know, like, in different poems where Iman is interested in her relationship with the mother who died while Iman was young, and but also, you know, like, the village and these forms of life which you know, like, which changed because Iman moved somewhere else, but still, you know, like, in touch with all of these things. So this question of inheriting the past, I think, you know, like, you can see traces of it happening on many different levels, so to speak. And like I said, you know, like, inheriting the past and inheriting the dead is really something different. It is a political question, because the dead is a political category, not only an ontological category, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Haytham. That line from Iman's book, well, from Anayat book, that Iman quotes, I think, is so interesting, because then your book starts with a search for the grave,
Yes.
right? And I think that's so much, like, what is so interesting about this is the way that actually your relationship with the search for her archive becomes this, like, very embodied process, right? That you walk the streets, that you sort of reconnect with her family members. And I think this sort of relationship to, because it's not just a relationship to the past, as you were saying, I think it has this very similar idea of a relationship to the dead that is one that is like sort of active and kind of dealing with the dead as sort of active agents, right? And hearing and listening to them in particular ways. I think, should we move on to the final round of readings?
The final reading, because we want to hear.
Exactly. Yeah. So actually, what's going to happen in this round is each of them is going to read a text by the other one that they selected. So yeah, we're mixing it up a bit here.
So I want to hear. Oh, I have the book. لا أنا عايزة عربي.
Oh, it's in the email.
Yeah. Sorry, we don't have printer in New York. I walked through the whole neighborhood looking for someone to print. I couldn't.
It's okay to read from the email?
Yeah. If I can see.
Yeah, it's not like that. It's not like that.
I will start with you because I just say few sentences. Why did I choose this from Haytham work? It's actually it's from a text that was published 2010 called أصوات الطبقة الوسطى, or the voices or the sounds of middle class. Yeah. So I actually choose this in particular because it's a very weird exercise when you have a friend who writes and you read their work in different stages and so on. You never ask the question about that you ask usually about your favorite writers. If there is a matrix, there is a place, a paragraph that I can see what will happen after. And this was important in the journey. It appears again and again in different ways. And since I reread Haytham, or some of Haytham work last week, I found out that this really passage for me is this matrix. That's it. هلع جلبة غامضة تأتي من بعيد، مزيج من صراخ جماعي وهتاف غير واضح، تستمر لبورها ثم تختفي، لا يمكن القطع بمصدرها أو معرفة ما إذا كانت حقيقية أو متوهمة. عندما تركت المدينة لتدير شؤونها بنفسها، لم يكن للثورة سوى أن توجد في مكان قصي، إما في أعمق نقطة في الداخل أي في المخيلة، وإما في أعمق نقطة في الخارج أي في وسط المدينة. لذلك فإنها عندما تقترب من البيت لتصل إلى الشارع الملاصق أو الشارع الذي يليه، يختلط الوهم بالحقيقة. هل هذا الهرج والمرج هو مظاهرة حقيقية هنا؟ أم أنه مجرد عراق بين السكان؟ هل هذه الأصوات حقيقية؟ أم أن الهذيان قد جعل الأصوات الآتية عادة من نشرات الأخبار تتردد بحرية الآن في الأذهان؟ الجلبة الغامضة مهما كان مصدرها تثير الهلع وتخلع القلوب، ووسط هذا الالتباس تظهر أسئلة صعبة تتطلب انحيازا واضحا. هل يغادر المرء بيته ليعرف ماذا يحدث ولو بدافع الفضول، أم يبقى لكي يدافع عنه إذا تعرض لاعتداء؟ ما معنى ما يحدث؟ ما الذي يقصدونه بالثورة؟ هل سيتسبب المولوتوف في اندلاع حريق يلتهم البناية بأكملها؟ هل يتعين تغيير مكان السيارة حتى لا تتعرض للأذى؟ وعندما تتراجع موجات الجلبة حاملة أسئلتها معها، لا تعود الطمأنينة وإنما يتبقى الهلع، وتتأكد المخاوف من أن الخارج هو مصدر الخطر الأعظم. كل ما يأتي من ذلك المكان يستعطي على الفهم أو التوقع، وإذا لم ينتبه المرء جيدا ستأتي الموجة القادمة عالية فتطيح بكل ما بناه. بعدها يتم تأمين الأبواب والشبابيك جيدا وغلقها بالمزاليك تحسبا للضربة القادمة. This is a pre-revolution text.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I would like to read you part of a text by Iman called الصوت في غير مكانه, or the displaced voice, which is also published in this publication from Belladonna. For two reasons, but maybe I'll say my reasons after reading. طيب, الصوت في غير مكانه. لنفرض أن الصوت هو خيط من الضوء يمتد بين فم المتكلم وأذن من يسمعه، بين النية وما تؤول إليه من تأويل في ذهن متلقيها، وأن اللكنة ذبذبات ملونة تتواتر حول هذا الخيط ولا تتطابق معه، أنها قد تساعد في تدعيم ضوء الخيط أحيانا كأنها رسالة إضافية لنيته، وأنها قد تقطعه وتعطله أحيانا أخرى. كلمة واحدة تسقط من جملة ملضومة في حبل مضيء كافية لأن يتوتر الخيط ويهتز. تتسع عينا صاحب الأذن وتنشط حاسة البصر لالتقاط الكلمة التي تسقط بفعل اللكنة قبل أن تصل إلى الأرض. قد تتسع عينا المتكلم أيضا، قد تحضر أعضاؤه كلها بلغاتها لتساعد في توصيل نيته رغم انقطاعاتها إلى الأذن التي تنتظرها. أظن أنني أفكر بالصوت الفردي هنا لا كمنتج فيزيقي للحبال الصوتية التي يحملها الهواء، ولا كحامل لنية اللغة وهدفها، ولا كنقيض للموت، بل كطاقة تولدها اللكنة لكي تحمل الصوت الفردي واللغة التي ينطقها والنية التي يقصدها. طاقة اللكنة تتبع وقتا أو إيقاعا آخر يخص اللغة الأم، وعندما يحملها الصوت في لغة أجنبية يولد التشوش الذي أتخيله وكأنه محاولة نطق لغتين في نفس اللحظة، واحدة ظاهرة والأخرى مختفية، واحدة تتحرك والأخرى مركونة وتحارب ضد الإهمال والترك. اللكنة ليست أحد أمراض النطق بالضرورة، بل هي دفاع اللغة الأم المستميت ضد الفناء، منافسة اللغة الأجنبية عبر تخريب العلاقة بين الصوت وإيقاعه، فيبتر مقطع هنا أو هناك، يتسارع حرف غريب حيث كان يجب أن يتباطأ، يقفز صوت على رأس صوت آخر ويقدم جزءا من فضائه. التخريب قد يأتي أيضا من كرم اللغة الأم في التعامل مع الوقت، فتضيف حركاتها لسواكن لغة أجنبية، فيصبح ستريت استريت وكلوثز. إذا تخيلنا أن صاحب اللكنة وهو يتلفظها هو فرد في غير مكانه، فنتخيل معا أن اللكنة هي صوت في غير مكانه. قد يتدرب صاحب اللكنة على أن ينتمي لمكانه الجديد، قد ينجح في تخبئة لكنته أو في قمعها طويلا، ثم تأتي تلك اللحظة التي يخونه فيها التدريب. ليست مصادفة أن لحظات الغضب هي أكثر اللحظات التي تقب فيها اللكنة بكامل بهائها، ربما لأن الغضب ألصق باستنفار الأحوال الصوتية من الرضا، أكثر تهييجا للذاكرة واستحضارا للغة الأولى التي تنتقم بممارسة صوتياتها وبإشاعة الفوضى. صاحب اللكنة ليس بالضرورة مهاجرا من لغة إلى أخرى، بل قد يكون مهاجرا من لكنة إلى أخرى داخل نفس اللغة. عم عوض بواب العمارة التي أسكن فيها في القاهرة يتحدث للسكان بأدب جم، بقاهرية لا غبار عليها، تقفز لكنته الصعيدية بمجرد أن يصرخ في أحد أبنائه أو يتعارك مع أحد بوابي العمارات المجاورة. صوت شخص ما قد يكون أكثر فردية في لغته الأم، يتم التعرف عليه بنبرته الشخصية، بحبته وتضلعاته إذا أردت الاعتماد على رولان بارت. حين يحمل الصوت لغة أخرى تشوش اللكن على فرديته، تشير بدأب إلى الصوتيات تشير بدأب إلى الصوتيات الجماعية المختبئة للغته الأولى. صوت ال H في الإنجليزية يصبح أقرب إلى الخاء العربية عندما تتحدث لي ناتالي زميلتي في العمل. إنه صوت الروسية وليس ناتالي فقط. في سنتي الأولى في أمريكا كان حرف صوت ال P
وما زال
يبدو لي مثل حجر قادر على إسقاط أي كلمة تحتويه من خيط الضوء الذي أقف وراءه. هذا هو الحرف الذي نسميه بالعربية باء ثقيلة، حرف ليس من لغتنا، ويكفي الفشل في نطقه لتخمين أن العربية هي لغة المتكلم المركونة في الداخل. Yeah, so the first reason I was thinking about this text is the mode of writing. This text is prior to Iman's book on motherhood and also prior to Anayat Zaid's book. This book is actually was published for the first time 2011, I think, in the publication of the middle year, which happily I co-edited with Maha Ma'moon. There is a reflective mode of writing which is very, very specific and very unique, and I think at that moment was also very helpful to open up ways of thinking about dislocation, for instance, but through really the traces in the voice, right? So there was something powerful, not only on the level of the content, but also on the form, so to speak, of this writing. And the second reason was actually the observation that the Arabic language has one single word for voice and sound, which is صوت, right? And I found it really very interesting because in the project which you were reading from the voices of sound of the middle class, or the voice of the middle class, which I was trying to trace the sounds which a specific social class, which is the middle class, is kind of producing, and it's a kind of a way to maybe make a revenge from the middle class, and I found it really fascinating how it's as if both of us took one meaning of thought and went in one direction. So at that moment I was really interested in sounds because I was trying to complicate the notion of listening, right? And here it seems as if Iman was interested in the other branch of the word sawt, which is the voice, trying to complicate the notion of speaking, where speaking become the site of an antagonism between not only the mother language and the other language, but also a social antagonism and political antagonism as well, and this kind of this complication of the act of speaking, I just found it, like fascinating to think about it coming, like as if like both attempts are coming from one word, right? Like, but kind of, like.
Thank you.
I have questions, but I think maybe we want to open up to the audience. Yeah.
And then we'll go to the bar.
Yeah, exactly. Because I feel like I can keep asking you questions for a long time. So maybe I'm not sure how. It's kind of a longish.
Not that long. I'm looking
People
at
have
it. I guess people
questions
have
and
to
they
come.
want to like wander to hear. That would be great. Questions or just project.
Tend to sit down.
We have so many questions.
أعتقد you need a minute to think.
Well, it's a pleasure to see you both here speaking English. It sounds really good.
With accent.
And asking in English. I think when I read أثر عناية الزيات for the second time, I was looking for reasons why I find this book my favorite book at the time. And I found many. So عناية الزيات stayed my favorite book until Haytham published his book.
Actually, for me too.
I think for you too. And thinking of why this book is my favorite, I find so many reasons. I've just finished my third reading right now after having read the manuscript. First of all, Ibn al-Muqaffa and Kalila wa Dimna is in itself a huge project to think of, and there is a lot here in the book about culture and contemplating culture, history, contemplating history, etc. So the whole question about re-bringing or reappropriating Ibn al-Muqaffa today is one big thing that in its own right would make this book my favorite. However, the other thing that makes this book my favorite and that I find even more fascinating is the way you deal with language. And I mean by this three things. In this book, and now talking to the readers, you will find three different ways of dealing with language. First, there's so many occurrences in the book where the etymology of a word is revisited. And it's revisited in a fascinating way because it's not only limited to what we see in the dictionary, we see what we see in the dictionary in Haytham's book. However, we go further. And we go further in many different ways. He does this in a magnificent way. Here's one first way of dealing with language. The second one is dealing with certain concepts like turas, like tarikh, like kitaba, like lugha. All these categories are dealt with in a way that is displacing them to serve the argument of what he's trying to talk about, but also to invite the readers to rethink these terms in other ways that I find also fascinating. There is a third way of dealing with language here. I think I forgot it. Okay, since I've got it, it takes me to my question. What's fascinating in Ibn al-Muqaffa for me is the way he brings all together all these voices, but you will never lose track of who is talking and who is speaking and to whom. Never. You will never lose track. And every time he invents a frame tale inside the frame tale he's making, you will never get lost. because he will make sure to bring you back to the first point, right? You didn't do that in your book. Neither in terms of the narration, like I kept wondering until the last word if you are going to take me back to the hand of Ibn Muqaffa or not, and you didn't, right? So the frame tail was not closed. That's one thing. The other thing is that main difference between the sound or the voice talking in the what we should call the fiction parts of the book, and the voice in what we cannot call fiction parts of the book. You didn't give us any justification of this change in voice, or you also didn't try to, I mean, there is, here it is, there is so little I in the non-fiction part, but there is many times of we. Who is that we, and why did you deal with voice this way? Thank you.
Wow.
لا انا ممكن اجاوب على فكره على السؤال ده بس مش هجاوب. لا هو حب كتابك مثلا من كتابي خلاص. مش هيجي معانا الجواب.
يعني thank you very much Afeni. Okay, yeah, where to start? Maybe, you know, like for those just who are not familiar with this book called Kalila Udimna, and Abdullah ibn Muqaffa, who is a writer and a scholar from the 8th century, and Abdullah ibn Muqaffa translated Kalila Udimna. Kalila Udimna is a translated book, and I think this is something very important to keep in mind. Translated from Farsi, and Farsi in its turn was translated from Sanskrit, right? Like, so that's the genealogy of the book, which of course, you know, like gives the question of Turath or heritage a fundamental twist, you know, like, so it's not, you know, like the pure origin, rather, you know, any origin is impure, you know. I really liked very much that you did not lose your way in the tales of Kalila Udimna, because I did. And the experience of reading Kalila Udimna for me was an experience of you know, like tapping in and tapping out. Like, you know, like sometimes I know who's speaking, and other times I need to remind myself, oh, how did we end up with a tree where which speaks toward somebody else, you know, like I have like to think. I mean, it's not difficult to trace back your way, but I was interested in the possibility of losing your way.